Sorry, we had some technical difficulties, but that's being cleared up now. Hi there, everybody. Sorry for the wait. We had some brief technical problems, but that is solved.
I had technical problems joining you.
Yeah, I think that may have been my fault. So we have a new chair.
You have a new what?
Say again?
You have a new what?
We have a new chair today, and I think I failed to properly give him the instructions for how to log in. So he's on his way now. Yeah, so sorry about that. But everyone can hear and see me properly?
I can, yes.
Perfect. And
yes, Peter, I can too.
I appreciate
your whole face.
Perfect. Good to hear your voice. Thank you.
Good to see you and hear you.
Mhm. And is Pranjal here? Yes. Hi, Pranjal. Can you hear and see me?
Hi, yes, I can hear you.
So just while our chair is joining, maybe we can just check that the sharing of your screen works.
Sure, give me a minute.
Thank you.
Can you see me?
Let's see. Yes, I can see you. Hello.
Okay. Hi.
And do you have slides today?
Yes.
Such an exciting title. So I currently see your, I think your presenter mode. So where I see the your notes and stuff.
Okay. Just give me a minute. I'll just open it.
Thank you. And I mean, it's not a problem necessarily, but good for you to know.
Yeah.
Hey, Jonathan.
Hi.
Sorry.
Sorry for the delay.
No. So I was just saying hi to Pranjal, trying to pronounce your name properly. I'm sure I'm doing a horrible job. And she's just testing her slide sharing.
Amazing, amazing, good.
So I'll leave you the chair duties from here, Jonathan. But welcome.
Super. Thank you very much. Hi, Pranjal and everybody. Very nice to meet you. Pranjal, did you succeed in testing whether the screen sharing worked?
Sorry?
Did you succeed in testing whether the screen sharing worked?
I just was trying that again. Just give me a minute.
Super, super. Amazing. Yes, I can see it here. Cool. All right. Well, it seems like we are ready. So just to remind you of the format, so approximately 40 minutes of presentation, which is going to be followed by 30 minutes of Q&A, and then in the end, 30 minutes feedback and questions from Carl. So if you're ready, feel free to begin the presentation.
Perfect. Okay. So, hi everybody. I'm Pranjal, and I am a neuroscience, BSc Neuroscience student at UCL. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can indeed.
Okay, thank you. So today I'm here to present on a topic that I've been sort of working on for the past year or so. And I've been looking at how interoception and exteroception both integrate together to form our emotional affect. So just to start off, a bit of background, interoception is basically in a sense, the perception of internal bodily states, all sorts of visceral signals, heartbeat, respiration, the gut-brain axis, and all sorts of visceral modalities. It's an umbrella term for a lot of modalities, and so is exteroception. It's an umbrella term for all sorts of external sensory input, such as vision, touch, audition, vibrations. The aim of this entire project is to basically say that our emotional affect is created by an integration of both our interoceptive and exteroceptive signals, and not one of them individually or not separately either. This entire project is based off of an extension of the predictive coding model. So the predictive coding model, in a sense, says that our brain constantly is comparing top-down predictions with bottom-up inputs to calculate a sort of prediction error. And this prediction error constantly updates the top-down predictions. This has been extended to interoception, and there have been theories about how the predictive coding model explaining interoception. So there have been theories about how prediction errors are the basis of our emotional affect. So that is to say, higher create anxiety, and but through material on this topic of the studies and literature that I was reading about, isolated interoception completely, and it definitely did not look much into how exteroception plays a role in the emotional affect that is created by the interoception as well. So I looked at more studies, and I found a lot of contexts where there was conflicting lived experiences versus what the literature said, such as just instances such as in generalized like anxiety disorders. A lot of people are told to focus on sensory output. A lot of people are told to focus on the outside world, to like tune into their senses, and this is what reduces the anxiety. So if interoception is the only modality that's creating a emotional affect, this would be a conflicting evidence. So I looked more into it, and I found a lot of studies which give more clinical evidence to this. Most of them were false feedback studies where an exteroceptive input, which did not match the interoceptive input, such as visual input, touch, vibroacoustic input, did not match a participant's heartbeat. It affected their emotional affect, it affected their bodily perception, and it affected how how confidently they feel about their own interoceptive signals. So this led me to believe that there is some sort of interaction between interoception and exteroception. And so I looked more into it and found some evidence supporting a new model that I created. One of the main pieces of evidence that I found was there were two studies, one doing an fMRI study and one an intracranial EEG studies. Both of these studies basically saw that when a participant focuses on an interoceptive task, their orbitofrontal cortex, which is known to be involved in top-down high processing of exteroception, was suppressed, whereas in the opposite scenario, when participants focused on an exteroceptive task, their ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is involved in higher cognitive prediction processing for interoception, was suppressed. So this reciprocal suppression sort of led me to believe that there's some sort of competition between the two streams. I also looked at behavioral studies. I saw multiple studies where focusing on a visual stimulus reduced a participant's interoceptive accuracy, and also the vice versa, which is when people were stressed because of noisy interoceptive signals, possibly they sort of tended to focus more on exteroceptive stimuli, and there was also some clinical evidence, which I want to get back into later, but this led me to believe that there's some sort of competition between the two streams. And I proposed a new hypothesized model to sort of incorporate all of this into one model. And this model basically says that there are two parallel inference streams, the interoceptive stream as well as the exteroceptive stream. Both these streams individually calculate their prediction errors. However, like I said, there's some sort of competition between the two streams. So when these two parallel streams are integrated, their prediction errors are compared, and this proposed model basically says that the stream with a lower prediction error and basically a higher precision is prioritized to create our emotional affect, and is prioritized to in turn update the model as well. So this model has a few key parameters. Is the arbitration constant. It's called W, and this tells you about how much our brain trusts an interoceptive signal compared to an exteroceptive signal. So when W moves towards 1, it basically says that the brain completely trusts an interoceptive signal and prioritizes it completely over an exteroceptive signals, whereas when W moves towards 0, it prioritizes the exteroceptive signal. So the other two key aspects of this model are one, something called the decay rate or decay constant, which basically it's about how many new experiences updates our model how many new experiences changes our model enough to shift the W to a significantly lower or higher value. And another variable here is the learning rate, which is how much does one particular event affect affect our updating of the priors. So we played around with these equations a bit. Also, this model is briefly just Bayesian equations, trying to model whatever I've explained mathematically. And we played around with these equations a bit. And what we found was that on the left, the figure on the left shows how when we stimulated an environment where either there was an exteroceptive, high exteroceptive bias present, that is the was very different from the W. The brain preferred the W shifted towards 1, which is the brain preferred interoceptive signals more. But over time, as with more iterations, as the brain keeps overcoming these priors by constantly updating its own model, these stagnated to an equilibrium of W to be 0. And this was the same case in the opposite direction, where there was an interoceptive error implemented. So this convergence is what we believe to be a more stable sort of a more stable emotional affect, where there's neither of the streams are biased, and neither of the streams are preferentially prioritized over the other. Then we played around with it a little more, and what we found was, when we reduced the decay rate, which is it means that you would need more experiences to update the model. What we saw was, when we introduced a bias, however much the brain tried to update the model, it stagnated at one of the extremes. And after that, we did another set of iterations. After the stagnation, however much we changed the initial condition and the input condition, the stagnation at one of the extremes remained. So that would mean, theoretically, that would mean that one of the streams is being picked over the other in a biased way to create your emotional affect, whether there's sensory noise or not, whether there's noise in that signal or not. And this is what we believe is the basis of affective disorders. So what we then did was, we looked at a lot of affective disorders, and we hypothesized that in conditions such as anxiety, which is known to have overweighted interoceptive signals, the W would shift towards 1, whereas on the other end of the spectrum, where such as PTSD, where exteroceptive signals are biased, it would shift towards 0. And we also sort of took into account depressive disorders, because depressive disorders are known to have underweighted interoceptive signals. But like in relevance to our model, we sort of called it more as overweighted exteroceptive signals, because the other end of the spectrum remains to be exteroception. And then we tried to see if our model holds true in previous studies. We found 3 studies in particular that had both HEP and SSVEP data for participants online, and basically HEP is heartbeat evoked potential, which is one modality of interoception and a sort of measure of interoception. It does not encompass all of interoception, but we used it to test our hypothesis. And SSVP, on the other hand, is steady state visually evoked potential, which we used as a measure of exteroception, although that's not the only modality that exteroception encompasses either. What we saw was, one of the studies had patients with generalized anxiety disorders, and the W that we calculated from this data did have a mean of about 0.8 and 0.89, if I'm not wrong. And another study that we saw had healthy patients, and the W there stagnated in the range of 0.4 and 0.6. So it remained very close to the midline. However, recently, after some more discussions with other professors, I've come to realize this may not be a spectrum of affective disorders, because solely because there's conflicting evidence, such as in PTSD, there are a lot of cases where interoceptive signals are overweighted, and also there are a lot of instances where depression and anxiety are simultaneously present, and according to the spectrum, they lie on the opposite ends. So it may not hold true in terms of categorizing affective disorders to this model. However, regardless of that, we still think that categorizing patients based on the spectrum of interoceptive overweighing versus exteroceptive overweighing, we could lead this model for one step further by applying it therapeutically. We saw a lot of studies where interoceptive training is something that PTSD and trauma patients go through to overcome that, which does sit well with our hypothesis that PTSD is an affective disorder which lies on the exteroceptive end of the spectrum, whereas exteroceptive training is something that is applied to anxiety disorders, such as the example I was talking about, where people with anxiety are told to tune into the senses and like name 5 things. Another thing that we want to look further into, but although we're not too sure about this, but this is something we want to explore more. We think that CBT approaches and cognitive behavioral approaches might have something to do with affecting the learning rate. The learning rate, just as a reminder, was a measure of how much does one particular event affect our top-down priors. Because what we saw in our model was that when you do have a higher learning rate, the model equilibrates to a 0.5 W to 0.5 much quicker than many iterations. So just to sort of summarize the model, what we're trying to say is that the model basically has 2 streams, interoceptive and exteroceptive stream, that it individually calculates the prediction errors for. These prediction errors are then weighed against each other, and the stream which has a lower prediction error is used to create emotional affect, and it's used to update the model as well. However, this model at the moment is completely theoretical, and it is inferred from a lot of studies. It's not. It is a very simplified model with very limited parameters. We aren't accounting for. We are encompassing both interoceptive and exteroceptive signals as one big signal. However, in reality, there's a lot of modalities that affect both interoception and exteroception. And although this is a simplified model, it's simplified for the sake of tractability, because interoception in itself is really hard to measure, and it's very debated in the measurement of interoception is very debated, and so is exteroception, because how do you metricize different stimulus on one spectrum, which is how do you metricize vision as well as hearing as well as touch to just one exteroceptive signal. There has been no empirical testing on our end for this model, but what we are trying to do right now is to test this out. One of our easiest ways to test this out was to have a forced choice task where a participant is presented with both interoceptive stimulus as well as an exteroceptive stimulus and asked to estimate a range between them. And based off of that, if we could categorize the participants on the spectrum of interoception overweighing versus exteroception overweighing, we could see if their weighing of the stimulus changes after interoceptive or exteroceptive training. And once we do that, we want to see if we could personalize profiles in the spectrum. That is, can we actually categorize a certain range of people on the spectrum? And also, can we actually metricize affective disorders within the spectrum as well? But yeah, that's about it. Pretty short presentation, but I would really like to thank Dr. Sandeep Kapila, who mentored me, helped me throughout this project. He had a lot of insights to give and also write the paper with me. So that's about it.
Super. Thank you very much, Pranjal, for the very, very nice presentation. In a good TNB style, we will now unmute our mics and give a round of applause. Very nice, Pranjal.
Thank you.
So now we will go into the Q&A session. So we'll give some room for people who might have some questions to the work that you've done. And people who want to ask a question can raise their hand. And if there's no one, then I will start out with one question that I had on the presentation. I didn't quite catch the data that you guys had been looking at, that you fit the model to. Where did you get that from? Was it a combination of neuroimaging and behavioral, or how was it?
So most of the data that we looked at, we didn't look at data, we looked at a lot of studies to propose the model. And we could only find data from 3 studies that had both modalities, interoceptive and exteroceptive inputs from
Right.
participants. 2 of the studies had participants diagnosed with anxiety, and they were studies with open source data sets for HEPs and SSVEPs. So we took HEPs as a measure of interoception and SSVEPs as a measure of exteroception, and then fit that into the model and calculated the predicted W. And what we found was that with anxiety patients, the mean of the W values we got was 0.89, which lies very close to 1
Right.
compared to with the one study which had healthy patients. Their the mean of their W lied between 0.4 to 0.6, and most of the values lied closer to 0.4, but they were also participating in a visual task. So we think it might be biased towards the exteroceptive stream because they were participating in the visual task.
Right. So with the visual task, the exteroception stream would have some kind of like weighting as opposed to the input of the interoception. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. All right. If there is anyone else who has a question, then I'll just give a couple of seconds to give them a chance.
Hey, I have a question.
Yes.
Firstly, thank you. I really enjoyed that presentation and thought it was very interesting. Just on the question of the psychiatric conditions and how there was maybe some associations between symptoms and different types of misalignment of interoceptive and signals. I was wondering if maybe, because some of them appeared to be opposite, but also co-occurring, I was wondering if you'd looked at any models of maybe just like dysregulation of interoceptive signals. The analogy I would think of would be ADHD often co-occurs with a lot of these conditions simultaneously, and it's to do with like dysregulation of dopamine, right, which relates to a whole bunch of predictions. So sometimes there's an excess, sometimes there's a lack. I guess I was just wondering if you sort of looked at that sort of angle, kind of unifying it through disorganization or something.
We haven't, because when I was working on this paper, I categorized based on biased literature, I suppose, anxiety as overweighing of interoception and PTSD and depression as overweighing of exteroception. But when I spoke to more people, I started to realize more that that may not be the case. But that is a very interesting angle. Another thing that when I was discussing with one of the professors that came up was, could it be that there is this spectrum of interoception versus exteroception overweighing, but it could be context dependent. That is, within some contexts, you prioritize interoceptive signals, which causes you like behavioral and clinical symptoms that are related to that, whereas some contexts sort of shift this weighing to the exteroceptive streams. That is, so more than disorganization, we've looked at it as context dependent. But yeah, I'm not sure if that answered your question, but
Thank you.
Super. And I see that Mark Broberg also has a question.
Yes. Hi there. Thank you. Thank you for your great and interesting presentation. Just a couple of questions. I'm just curious if I assume there must be some variability of W that it sort of has a rhythm. I know we're looking at this idea that a non-clinical group seems to have this kind of average, nice balanced W, but there must be some adaptive reasons why, that's a snapshot, right? And throughout the rhythms of a day or over time, there would be this biasing depending on the needs of the person, right? So interoceptive might be increasingly weighted during times of, stress and hunger. And so I'm curious if you noticed anything about that. And then just kind of a more of a fundamental question. I think it's interesting to look at emotion or affect as this integration of interoception and exteroception, but I still kind of wonder how does that emerge? Are we faced with this hard problem of emotional experience there? And I don't know how tractable the second question is, but at least the variability of W, I wonder if you can speak to that.
so the variability of W, I think, again, like you said, you were mentioning the context dependence of exactly what I was talking about before. But I think in terms of both these studies, the participants were asked to do certain tasks. So I think this is more of a controlled situation, controlled setup, controlled method. So maybe that could be one reason why there wasn't much variability within the W that we saw. There was some variability in the healthy participant group compared to the anxiety group, but it's still fixated within the range of 0.4 and 0.6, which is compared to a 0.9, it is much closer to an equilibrium. And the more I've thought about this sort of this model, I also think it's not theoretically, it's not actually possible to get an exact value of W to be 0.5, because if we're saying that the brain prioritizes one stream over the other, that would mean that if it's in constant competition, both of them cannot be equal at any given point. One of them has to be picked over the other. So, if what I like to think about this as is when the W value is close to the equilibrium, it just means that the prediction errors on both the streams are low, but one of the streams still has a higher precision than the other, which is creating the emotional affect. But since the prediction errors on both the streams are low, the emotional affect isn't that extreme. And I'm sorry, I've lost track of your second question, but
That's okay. I just was, thank you for addressing that. Yeah, I was just trying to appreciate how it seems as if we have interoception in the model, interoception and exteroception somehow integrating to, it sounded like create the emotional experience. And I'm wondering if it, how that happens, right? I guess that's just more of a philosophical question of how do emotions arise from those two signals fundamentally. But right, I suppose that's more of a hard question of emotions, perhaps. I'm not sure. But thank you.
thank you.
All right, and I see that Patrice Duquette also raised a hand.
Hi, nice presentation. I'm a psychotherapist and have done some writing on interoception and mostly, and emotion being the natural response, feelings being when we know we have an emotion. And the way that you're presenting your ideas, I think it fits that you can say interoception, exteroception, and call it good. You do have to consider motivation and that question that you were trying to answer regarding why one stream might take over the other. Motivation would be a primary reason. There's also memory, which fits into motivation, but also may have a distinct reason. I can also, we could have a conversation. You could add psychotherapy in there, like not analysis, but like relationally based psychotherapy, psychodynamic psychotherapy. As I work with patients in group and individual, and work on tuning the attention to interoception or exteroception, going by Carl's idea, the only thing we can control our attention. And when we control our attention, we can control how we're reacting behaviorally. We can't control our emotions. They'll happen. The other interesting, so in 2010, over a very long time, I wrote a paper on the real relationship in psychotherapy, which was primarily for psychotherapists, and talked about the relational aspects and how important they were in terms of change. But at the end, I took a little foray into what could be some of the neuroscience behind why the relationship is so important. And I had found a German author who unfortunately couldn't speak English, so I couldn't really delve into his work too far. But he had done a study with, I think you would call it the Wisconsin card sorting task, where you look at a set of cards and then you look at a second set and you have to recognize whether the card is in the first set or the second set. When you see the card, is it a new card or is it from the second set? And he determined that the ventral medial prefrontal cortex or orbital cortex was active at that time. And my supposition in this paper, way long ago, before I knew really anything about interoception, I had just learned the word in 2009, was that essentially this having to decide between this current moment and a prior event was reality testing. So this area, this ventral medial prefrontal cortex, I, took a step out there and said, I think that's where we're discerning reality, which is one reason why I anchor my therapeutic intervention in a reality-based relationship, a real relationship, which has emotional state, not to sound too cognitive. But your statement about interoceptive, exteroceptive, and you bring out the ventral medial cortex, is really in determining more and more accurately which is relevant, the ventromedial, the exteroceptive or the interoceptive in that ventromedial area. Slowly but surely, if you had forever, you could ultimately discern reality, like as it stands at the moment. Which piece of information from which stream is the most relevant to say, this is the moment and this is what's happening for a moment, millisecond, or for long, you could do it. But I found it interesting that it reminded me your question about how does this W number like affect people's experience. And one more thing, the question about anxious people and whether it's interoceptive or exteroceptive, it's really, that's a very individualized question. And I don't think the research trying to determine how do we measure it in an anxious person, first we have to find out what delineates this type from that type. There's people who are more interoceptively involved, like that's all they can recognize. And they're anxious about it because they're recognizing that. Then there's people who there's, for some reason, a lack of interoceptive recognition, sensation, and it's still working its magic behind the scenes, and that's what they're anxious about. So we have to do a better diagnostic evaluation. I have patients in my practice which are either one. And it is more difficult if they're more interoceptively involved. It's really hard to pull them out and say, no, let's look out here, because they've got a lot more information from the inside to tell them what's going on, and they have to guard against it. But I thought your study was interesting in the mathematical work to say this is how you might look at it. You will have to, when you publish this, though, figure out a way to add in the other elements of emotion and what they might have to say. You can leave it like, you can actually flip what I did, which take it and put it at the end and say, well, if you consider these elements that people have spoken about, then you would say, I could look at it that way. You don't have to have it in the middle when you're starting.
First of all, thank you so much for all of that. That was a lot of new information that I could add on to the model. And we are thinking about adding more components to the model, but probably not at the moment, because our focus was to test and see if we can, first of all, like at the very basic level, categorize people on picking an interoceptive stream or exteroceptive stream and rebalance that in a controlled condition. Only then can we look at how other modalities play a role within this. So this is a much more simplified model than adding in on about motivation, learning, and just other biases in general that are present. But that is something that we want to go into more. But yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, you use the word biases, which I understand. The difficulty is when you say bias, it already it connotes or denotes, Carl and all, that it has a negative connotation. And when you're talking predictive coding, there's some other words that are less loaded regarding why they might be headed in that direction. I'm not going to pull them out of my vocabulary right now. I'm just saying, like, I think maybe neuroscientists may be negative on bias, but anybody else is going to say, oh, okay, well, that means this or that. They have, they are set in a certain way to be interoceptive or exteroceptive. That's due to priors, all sorts of things. So in the moment also, but just when I hear that word, it's just I'm a psychiatrist, but as a psychotherapist, I'm always like, okay. It's a little limited, but also at the same time says something else that you don't necessarily mean. So, but thanks for the presentation.
Super. Thank you so much for all the very good questions and input. I'll just give a couple seconds more if anybody is holding in a question. Otherwise, I think we will move on to the next part, which is the feedback and questions from Carl. So, Carl, I'll give you the mic.
Right. Is it my turn now?
It is indeed.
There you go. Thank you very much. Good. So yeah, again, excellent presentation. Short but sweet, and some excellent discussion afterwards. I'm going to provide feedback under the assumption that you are going to take this work forward. I'm mindful you're a BSc student, so I imagine you've got other things on your table at the moment, but I also imagine that your supervisors have got some stakeholding in this area, and therefore this is one glimpse at a story that will be told over the years. So what I've done is, whilst listening to the presentation and the ensuing discussion, I've been foraging for papers that might be useful in telling the story and possibly guiding, or at least qualifying or motivating both the current and envisaged simulations using the predictive coding formalism that you currently have. So just to sort of tackle a couple of sort of broad points before I've got about sort of 5 to 10 papers. I'll just quickly put up on the screen, remembering that this is being recorded. So my hope is that you will ignore me while I'm talking. But if I say anything interesting, you can go back to the recording and then pick out the paper that you liked. And if you haven't read it already, then try and find something in it that speaks to your argument and the sort of axis of or balance as a mechanistic explanation for psychopathology of various sorts. But some broad themes. When people in my world talk about emotions, then it's usually in the context of one or two settings. Either it's basically understanding valenced inference at its simplest. Is this on or off, or good or bad? Am I certain, or am I confident about what to do next, for example? Or it's cast in terms of affective inference. What is the affect associated with particular engagement with the world, this perceptual synthesis, which can clearly be cast in terms of predictive processing and predictive coding. And then at the highest level, it would be emotional inference, and what emotion best explains all of the evidence, the sensory evidence at hand. And that view, I think, accommodates this. And then there are interesting questions about talking about emotions and emotional inference. And just to address Mark's comment, I'm not sure it's terribly philosophical. I mean, it certainly could be made philosophical, but if you wanted to simulate an emotional artifact, there are fairly straightforward rules that you'd have to follow to do that. which makes it slightly more pragmatic in an issue and an important issue. If you eventually wanted to simulate a predictive coding scheme based upon a generative model that could also represent the fact that it was in one of a small number of emotional states, and either read out from the predictions in the predictive coding model, or get it to tell you that it was feeling sad or anxious or embarrassed or whatever. And that's just as an aside, just open brackets, that's quite a current issue in machine learning and artificial intelligence research. So people are now earnestly trying to make their chatbots able to recognize different emotional states and also respond empathetically by adopting the same emotional state. So it's a really important issue, not just theoretically in theoretical neuroscience and computational neuroscience, but also commercially. If you can make Claude recognize that you were feeling a bit down or stressed or embarrassed, then that's going to increase its uptake and interactions and presumably the incidence of AI psychosis. So it's a really important area. But notice none of this speaks to the other sort of context in which these conversations are had, which is the context of computational psychiatry and psychopathy. Can we now, because we understand or have a mechanistic explanation for affective inference or processing and emotional processing of a slightly more self-reflective sort, can we now understand how those mechanisms go awry in psychopathology? And that's what you've been talking about largely. So I think it may be useful just to make that in an introduction. If you're going to do your PhD thesis in this, or your senior colleagues were going to write their next paper, that would be, I think, a useful way to start in terms of underwriting the importance of understanding the computational architecture of emotions. If we just return to the first thing, I said emotions. So if you wanted to write a predictive coding scheme that was emotional, you'd have to equip it with representations that I am in one of a number of emotional states. And if it was in continuous state space, you'd have to have that as a sort of multidimensional construct. And you could turn to the big five or the big 10, I can't remember, but there are some dimensional constructs of emotion. And therefore, you'd simply treat it as something else that has to be represented and predicted at lower levels, very much as a predictive coding scheme can recognize MNIST digits or recognize a color or classify something as a car. You would also have to now write down a generative model in which the scheme, the predictive coding scheme, was able to recognize I'm in this emotional state or I'm in that emotional state. And then that introduces two really interesting questions, both of which were alluded to in the discussion, which would have to be addressed in your simulation. First of all, why on earth would you need to know that you are in an emotional state? Well, if it affects the things that you do or what you pay attention to, then and if paying attention is a kind of covert action, a mental action, an inside behavior, then immediately you are in the world of precision weighting, precision control. So simply being in a particular emotional state will then allow you to coordinate or adjust the balance of precision to various modalities and at various hierarchical levels. And you could either articulate it like that for a computer scientist, or you could say to a psychologist, being in an emotional state means that I can optimally deploy my attention, my endogenous attention, to this modality or that modality or this level of abstraction or that level of representation in a way that is apt for this situation, which has induced this emotion. I recognize I'm in this emotional state, and therefore I can attend in the right kind of way to what's going on. So I think that's a powerful argument as to why you've settled on the balance of the precision between the interoceptive and exteroceptive. That is clearly one incredibly important balance. the second thing that comes to mind is, okay, so what are the sources of evidence for me being in a particular emotional state? And of course, at this point, you can't, you suddenly then have to sort of carve the different kinds of sensory evidence into interoceptive, exteroceptive, and proprioceptive. And then the argument would be, and many people pursue this argument, particularly sort of the Neil Seth school, but I would imagine also to a certain extent the sort of the Lisa Feldman Barrett school, that you can't do this without interoception. You can't recognize you're in an emotional state unless you've got evidence from your interoceptive modalities. And furthermore, you would need that in the sense that if you're going to act ultimately in the right kind of way, you're going to need to engage certain autonomic reflexes. So it has to be on the, has to be on the inside of the body previously. So I think that's probably worthwhile saying as well. That you could talk about emotional inference without any reference to the particular modalities. And say, as some people do, that just being in a state of high anxiety or depression, for example, being in a state of high anxiety is just that I am uncertain. I've lost precision over the beliefs about what I'm going to do next, without talking about interoception. You could say that depression can be fully described by being stuck in a rut. That rests upon having very precise beliefs about the way that I act. I act in a way that includes a certain degree of social withdrawal, a certain degree of psychomotor poverty, and all the symptoms and signs that we would associate with depression. But I think that you need to make, and you should make, the strong argument that's not a complete story. You really need your body as the organ, the best sensory organ at hand to give you the most informative data about the emotional state you're in. And that then begs the question that so the most important balance of attention or precision then is exactly what you've been pursuing. So in answer to Mark's question, where does the emotion, what causes the emotion? The answer is very simple. It is just a hypothesis, a posterior belief about some latent state that is the best explanation for, and therefore can predict, a spectrum of interoceptive and proprioceptive sensory inputs. It just so happens that this particular set of latent states lies in an emotional space that we recognize as emotion, and much of the actions that ensue from being in a particular emotional state are covert in the attentional sense, but also covert in terms of engaging autonomic reflexes. So I wouldn't be able to see whether you've got any cardio acceleration. I could see other things like sort of micro expressions, vasodilation, blushing, for example, if in love or if you're embarrassed, but a lot of it is covert. So that's how I would answer Mark's question, and then he would sort of say, okay, well, show me one, and then you could build one. You could build one that actually got anxious when it saw a spider, for example, because it had certain prior beliefs and was also using evidence from the body in order to assimilate all the different multimodal inferences, multimodal evidence that is going to be most simply explained by the fact I am currently anxious, or I'm currently depressed, or I'm currently, wanting. Well, there are all sorts of ways of classifying emotion. If you talk to Mark Soames, you'd have to use a sort of Panksepian sort of way of carving up emotions in this instance. Perhaps they're more like affects as opposed to emotions, but that's probably another conversation. The psychopathology side of the argument, which you sort of, I think you need to engineer your full. If you were doing a PhD thesis, you'd have to sort of set up the basic neuroscience of this kind for emotional inference, and then say, now let's turn to psychopathology. And on that reading, you have already sort of written about the fact that this is a failure to precision weight in a balanced way both different modalities, exteroceptive and interoceptive in this instance, but also don't forget that there's also a balance between the sensory precision and the prior precision in a hierarchical model. Now, you implicitly have that in your simple simulations, but it hasn't been leveraged in the way that you would need to, I think, to tell a longer term story. So it could be that I suppress the precision of both my sensory, interoceptive and exteroceptive sensory inputs, and just rely upon my prior beliefs and just ignore evidence from the world. More importantly, one important way of conceptualizing this and also telling a story to other people in computational psychiatry is that often it's not the ability to increase the precision weight, it's the ability to attenuate it, to reduce it, to ignore selectively. So if you are talking to a psychologist, this would be sensory attenuation. So one way of looking at your balance between the exteroceptive and interoceptive would be to say that excess precision weighting on interoceptive signals can also be construed as a failure of interoceptive sensory attenuation. And that would be a really useful way to frame it, because most of psychiatric disorders can usually be tracked down to a failure to attenuate the sensory precision in one or more modalities. So the poster child of this would have been, a decade or so ago, would have been autism. So autism would, the story here would be that there is a failure to attenuate exteroceptive and possibly interoceptive prediction errors, which means that you are glued to the elemental sensory input. You cannot ignore, you cannot attend away from all the sensory fluctuations in any modality. So how are you going to respond and what consequences? And of course, from that you can derive most of sort of the classical triads, but also a lot of the other aspects of being at least severely autistic. And then you can sort of work that story right through to delusional systems, schizophrenia, and indeed even some neurological syndromes like Parkinson's disease, all predicated on the kind of false inference that ensues with the failure of sensory attenuation to suppress one in favor of the other, for example. So I'd recommend you use that particular perspective on the balancing, because the balance basically, there are lots of different balances you have to get right, but they are manifest in terms of either putting things down, which is sensory attenuation, or bringing things up. And it looks as if most of the empirical evidence looks as if people have difficulty actually attenuating. They have a difficulty ignoring. They have difficulties decreasing the precision, not difficulties increasing it. So I think that would be, if you like, another important theme to emphasize before you get into the nitty-gritty of the mechanics and the simulations as to why it's potentially important in the setting of understanding psychopathology. And then you can get into, at the end, then you can talk about all the remediations that you were in discussion with Patrice about, and Mark. In terms of how do you get good control over your precision weighting again, and then you can try and mentalize it. You can take drugs, all sorts of ways of getting back at that. Just engaging sensory attenuation, like rubbing your tummy when you're in pain. I should say that sensory attenuation is necessary to act. So one of the important things about sensory attenuation is if you don't attenuate the proprioceptive and interoceptive evidence that you are not currently acting, then any prior intention to act will immediately be revised because there's evidence against the fact that you are currently acting. So you have to attenuate in order to move. And sometimes you can use that to remedy or remediate a failure of sensory failure in one modality using another modality. So that would be an extra somatosensory behavior implicitly attenuating interoceptive gut feelings, to rubbing your tummy to make a tummy ache go away, for example. If you'll indulge me, I'll share my screen and just take you through a couple of papers that make that point make those points, so that my primary motivation here is really to give you bits of the literature that you can turn to just to endorse or rephrase or paraphrase or draw the dots with, that substantiate and motivate the current simulations and the simulations that you're doing. While you were talking, I have happily found your paper. Where has it gone? Oh, there we are. That's your paper. Is this your paper? Excellent. Yeah, so I know which papers you've read and which papers you haven't. So, because I was able to look at the references, and it seems as though you've taken a sort of quasi UK University of Sussex slash to a certain extent Lisa Feldman Barrett, but possibly more like Sarah Garfinkel and Hugo Critchley, with a nod to Neil Seth perspective on sort of hypersensitivity and that sort of take on interoceptive inference, which is, I think, exactly the right perspective to take, given the people you've cited. However, you've missed slightly more formal simulations of interoceptive inference and how it might underwrite emotional inference. So so I just wanted to pick up those. In no particular, well, should we? Yeah. Forgive me. This is going to be a stream of consciousness, and I'm going to use the papers to remind myself what I thought would be useful to say at each point. One interesting branch of work does not address directly emotions, but it does address affect. If you wanted to equip your predictive coding scheme with the ability to infer what is the most appropriate deployment of precision at the moment, you would be using a deep hierarchical generative modeler. When I say deep model, I just mean a hierarchical model. So you've got predictive coding layer upon predictive coding layer upon predictive coding layer. But the important aspect of these generative models is what you're predicting is not just the content that explains the state of affairs in the world. It's also predicting the precision. And when you write it down like that, then you've immediately got a mechanics and a calculus that allow you now to simulate failures of predicting the precision and start to associate the precision control, the precision weighting, and inferences about the particular precision I should be weighting, set of precisions I should be weighting with certain affective states. And generally what happens is that you associate negatively valenced affective states with uncertainty and positive valence states with a high precision, but particularly over the things that are pertinent to you as an agent, but what am I going to do next, as opposed to states of the world. So, you don't need to read this, but I think it is interesting to build up these predictive processing schemes hierarchically to actually work out the maths of not just what would happen if I got the balance of precisions wrong, but how that could be learned and how you'd infer what is the right balance. So you have to have a mechanics of predictive coding like scheme that actually gives you Bayes optimal estimates of the precision and when and where it should be deployed. There's no particularly useful. Well, no, perhaps you should just read that and see if you can find anything useful in the way that they frame the problem. I should say that when you get into this literature, the usual inference scheme that is used is not actually predictive coding. It's something called variational message passing or belief propagation. And the difference between the two is that predictive coding is good for continuous variables like velocity or intensities or the like, whereas discrete state space models that you would use for belief propagation and variational message passing carve the world or states the world into discrete states. So you've got to be in this state or that state or that state. So the actual simulation of an emotional artifact, for example, would require a slightly different kind of maths. So the maths you've used is known as predictive coding or Bayesian filtering. At its simplest, we've actually used a Kalman filter because it's a quasi-linear generative model. But when you move into these discrete space models, you're using variational message passing, which mathematically is very similar, but you write it down differently. It's actually actually a bit simpler than predictive coding. Again, if you do your PhD in this, you're likely to use not predictive coding, but partially observed Markov decision processes. And the software that does those is now freely available on GitHub under the rubric of PyMDP, Python implementation of active inference using Markov decision processes, PyMDP. That would be the preferred simulation environment to get this high level, deep simulation of message passing and predictive processing. And that comes under the rubric of active inference, which is another way of talking about predictive processing beyond predictive coding. I mentioned that because that's going to be relevant for one of the last little papers that you might find useful. Another sort of area or literature that you might want to look into, again, just to sort of show that you are dealing in an important area which touches on other areas, would be the work of people like Mark Soames in neuropsychoanalysis. Patrice sort of alluded to that field in her conversation with you. So Mark Soames is one of the world's experts on Freud, but is also one of the world's experts on disorders of feeling and its disorders from a neuropsychological point of view and an analytic point of view. And his thesis is that it's all about the encoding of the precision. It's all about, so he talks about uncertainty, which is the inverse precision, and he regards the precision as the basis of feeling. So again, it's at the level of affective inference, not emotional inference, but affective inference, the way that you feel about something. This is one of many articles. He's actually written a book on this called The Hidden Spring, but it may be sufficient just to cite his explicit reference to uncertainty or felt precision or felt uncertainty as the basis of actually feeling things. And that's why I mentioned Panksepp, because at that level, emotions really are read as affects and drives and feelings, which are probably best articulated by Panksepp. So there's that. Mark Soames, where are there? Mark Soames, there he is. We've done that one. We've done that one now. So if we now turn to the literature on, I notice you referenced Mika Allen, but you didn't reference this work, and that I think means that you are denying yourself a body of literature where people have actually simulated the integration of interoceptive and exteroceptive information, but not using predictive coding, but using active inference and belief propagation or variational message passing. So I think you'd enjoy this paper simply because it deals explicitly and celebrates the importance of hearts in looking at flowers or spiders. And they were actually able to simulate, if I remember correctly, synthetic ERPs. Where are they? Oh no. Oh, they are. Yeah. So their predictive coding scheme, which wasn't, it was a generalization predictive coding. It was a I repeat, an active inference scheme. Not only was able to recognize flowers or spiders, but it was also attending to its own heartbeat. And also, interestingly, acknowledging that the exteroceptive modality depends upon the interoceptive modality, or the interoceptive state at any particular time in exactly the way you described, because at certain phases in the heart, in the cardiac cycle, you actually get a kind of blanching of the retina. So you don't see so well with reduced precision in at certain phases in the cardiac cycle, which means your heart rate has an effect on the precision of your exteroceptive input. And he leveraged this in the simulation to show how one could integrate interoceptive and exteroceptive dependencies in a deep generative model that allowed him to talk, so basically to model, to model these affective states that are deeply informed by one's autonomic status and information from the autonomic nervous system. So I think this is probably the most pertinent paper for you. But again, this is for the future, because this is not predictive coding, this is active inference. So it's slightly more complicated kind of simulation. Yes, you referenced that. That's fine. I just put this here so just to represent the interoceptive inference commitment to the failure of precision weighting in exactly the way that you have described. I think that was an important point, which was foregrounded in this paper with Anil Seth. Turning now to mood. I don't think you referenced this paper, but it also tells a very similar story to your simulations, in that you're talking about sort of long-term commitments to certain kinds of precision weighting. And you implemented that with this alpha parameter and different learning rates. I think it's useful for you to tell the reader in subsequent papers that a learning rate is a precision, and a precision is a learning rate. Mathematically, they're the same thing. And you know that in predictive coding, because whenever you weight a prediction error in the service of driving a change in some expectation, the change in expectation is per unit time. Therefore, the precision has to be expressed per unit time. So it's always going to be a learning rate. So when you introduced pi, your precisions, and alpha, your learning rates, you were effectively putting two precisions in play. And sometimes they're called sort of hyper precisions, when it's the precision of one is modulating the change in the precision of the other one. So implicitly, that's why I said you had a deep generative model. You had a separation of timescales implicitly on a generative model, where you were learning the precision. But of course, the learning of the precision itself has an implicit precision, which is the learning rate. That is exactly the same story told by this gentleman. I think has probably moved on now. This is quite a long time ago. But a thoughtful treatment. I've never met James or his supervisor Stuart, but I did help them write this paper, where they were telling exactly the same story about the difference between an emotion and a mood. So you can feel bad, you can feel miserable in the moment, and that's very distinct from having a low mood, as in a depressive and affective neurotic disorder. And he made that distinction between the temporal timescales in exactly the same way that you were using the distinction between pi being too high on exteroceptive or low on interoceptive, and this converging to learning to be in these different states at a much slower timescale, and then getting stuck there. And that's a sort of key point in computational psychiatry. If you get stuck in a particular, very precise set of beliefs, it's sometimes very difficult to undo that, because you preclude the opportunity to seek evidence against your precisely held convictions, and therefore you literally get stuck in a rut. So he goes through the sort of in narrative form, if I remember. So I don't think there are any simulations in this, but it did strike me that this was a nice, if you like, parallel to your story that makes a lot of sense of the alpha and pi and the separation of timescales in terms of inference under certain beliefs about precision at the moment, versus inference in terms of what precisions there should be over a much longer time scale that was experience dependent, moderated by that the number of events that I have experienced in the past. So I thought that would be useful. What's this one? Oh yeah, another simulation using message passing that again rests upon an admixture of synthesizing, accumulating, or using both interoceptive and exteroceptive evidence for various states of the world and their implications for behavior, was done by Adam Linson. He used to be in Scotland, but now he's at the Open University, and is somebody you might want to collaborate with. He's a very collegiate young man. And he was trying to simulate mice that get very frightened and hide in a hole when they think that predators are around, as a model for post-traumatic stress disorder. So very much like you, trying to sort of get a mechanistic understanding of these varieties of psychopathologies in an encompassing and relatively straightforward or simple framework. He was trying to do the same using belief updating under active inference that included the interoceptive and exteroceptive modalities to understand post-traumatic stress disorder. And is still currently writing along those lines. So he may be somebody you might want to reach out to see how far he's got. And also, it will be useful if he could refer to your work, saying that this bilateral interoceptive exteroceptive precision weighting is extremely important in understanding the mechanics of post-traumatic stress disorder or response to stresses and psychological trauma in a computational setting. This paper I've just put up, it was, if you like, one of the foundation papers to make it very explicit that the kind of false inferences that underwrite most of the psychiatric syndromes that people like me encounter as a biological psychiatrist can be explained by broken precision weighting at somewhere in your generative model. This goes through the maths and uses numerical simulations to simulate hallucinations, to simulate failures of sensory attenuation in people with schizophrenia, for example, using the force matching illusion and other things. I won't go through it, nor do I think you necessarily need to go through it, other than it's useful to know it's there because it provides the base optimal predictive coding equations, because these simulations did actually use continuous state space models, so this is predictive coding, and it shows you can simulate hallucinations, delusions, and other things that can be read of as phenomena associated with psychopathology using a predictive coding formalism. But it's more complicated than yours because it's deep, it's hierarchical, and also the alphas and the pi's are also just updated to minimize variational free energy, or they are there are no choices here. The learning rate is estimated as that which maximizes the model evidence in the spirit of the free energy principle and active inference. So his pies here. Well, does he have? No. Anyway, you can get into that, and should you want to, this might be a useful point to start from in terms of the next wave of simulations you might want to do, to take it into deep models where there's an explicit distinction between interoceptive and exteroceptive, and then implement the precision updating, the learning in a Bayes optimal fashion. So that's that as a new point of. I just put these two papers up because I smiled when you said it's a very abstract model and there are no biological mechanisms. I don't think you need to worry too much about that. If you can write it down as a Kalman filter or a predictive coding scheme, or a belief propagation or variational message passing under a Markov decision process, there are already papers out there that say this is biologically plausible and this is how you'd map it to neurobiological processes. So if you want to use PyMDP an active inference to do the variational message passing discrete kind of simulations of the kind that Mika Allen was using and Adam Linson were using, then you can refer to this paper, which just unpacks the equations in terms of neurobiological processes. If, on the other hand, you wanted to use your predictive coding equations, there are papers out there. This is the canonical, literally, paper that you can cite to say that this is a biologically plausible implementation of belief updating in the brain. For details, please see Bastos et al., for example, and many other papers. So I wouldn't worry too much about the biological plausibility. That's the whole point of these schemes, is that they have been, people have committed to them because they are biologically plausible and enable you to understand precision weighting, for example, in terms of postsynaptic gain or excitation inhibition balance, or disorders of precision weighting in terms of modulatory synaptopathies and the like. So don't be shy about you don't need to be falsely modest about the biological plausibility of it. And you don't even need to really. That's your paper. Good, we've done that. Yeah. I'm not sure whether this is going to be useful, but if you really wanted to drill down on the actual maths of deep hierarchical generative models and their inversion that includes the precision, learning of the precision, interestingly using an alpha here, but in a Bayes optimal, in a first principles way, then this paper is probably the sort of primary resource. It's got everything in it. It doesn't matter whether you're a computer scientist or a neurobiologist. It just covers everything for you. This particular section is all about perceptual salience and uncertainty and the mechanics of updating your precisions in a biologically plausible way. And the paper itself is, I don't know how to scroll up the eyes. No, okay. The paper itself is, so this is the bit for the statisticians and computer scientists. Hierarchical models in the brain. Again, quite an old paper, but it's got all the maths you might need should you want to do more elaborate simulations along the lines than the ones you've already done. It's useful, I think, just to bear in mind when you're talking about precision control, there are two basic flavors of this. There's a very sort of low-level precision control of the kind that you might associate with exogenous attention. Just knowing that your eyes will know that you're in the dark because you can't predict anything, and therefore, by Weber's law, they will adapt. And that adaptation is a kind of optimization of the precision. So, usually darkness means something that is very imprecise. The signal to noise is basically zero if you turn off the lights. That evaluation of the optimal level of precision weighting can be done locally, and you can generalize that to sort of automatic attentional deployment in the visual system. And the neurobiology of that, again, has been worked out and associated with the underlying differential equations that you would use in order to evaluate the local precision, to contextualize it, given what you're actually trying to predict in the predictive coding sense in the moment. And if you're interested, you could read about that in this paper by writer Kanai, Cerebral Hierarchies and Predictive Processing Precision in the Pulvina, as an account of this very sort of low level kind of precision. Now, it may be that people with certain psychopathologies have a failure of, say, sensory attenuation under these local mechanisms in, say, the autonomic nervous system or autonomic hierarchy, or the sort of, the interoceptive hierarchy. However, I think it's important to bear in mind that when you move on to these very deep models where you're talking about emotions, you're normally talking about conditioning the precision on states of being, on emotional states of being. which is much more like endogenous attention and the kind of thing that you could actually mentalize and use talking therapies to change. So there's a sort of local automatic adjustments of precision that you probably were not sort of cognitively penetrable. You wouldn't be aware of them in the sense that you could be aware, or at least behave as if you are aware that you are feeling anxious. That there may be lower level precision adjustments going on. To get that high level emotional aspect, you probably need to look at simulations that have this very deep structure. So I'm just forewarning you, when you get into the simulation of attention and precision weighting literature, it comes in two flavors: predictive coding, very low level, subpersonal, and then variational message passing active inference, which is usually discrete state spaces, but with much deeper models, where I think you are licensed now to simulate emotional inference. Yes, I just put this up. I'm not sure. This was just another literature using predictive coding formalisms in the interoceptive hierarchy to try and understand pain and nociceptive inference, actually in the context of autism, by I think Jim, this was the senior author, Chauncey, who's one of the leading lights in computational psychiatry, I think has moved away from this area of research. But 10 years ago, a lot of people were looking at interoceptive processing through the lens of predictive coding and looking for evidence in this instance using direct causal modeling for the correlates of abnormal precision weighting, which is basically a postsynaptic gain or connectivity or synaptic efficacy that you can actually estimate from evoked responses. So it might be, if useful, if you just go back to this early work on pain and autism, that might again provide you with a few more references that emphasize the importance of interoceptive precision, in psychopathology, in particular in autism. And that's it. I've got nothing else to say.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for all of that. I have a lot of work to do now, a lot of things to build on, a lot of things to read.
Are you going to do that work then? As a BSc student, I mean, are you allowed to often do your research?
I mean, not the research work, but at least the readings and coming up with a project proposal, hopefully, and proposing it as a PhD, hopefully soon.
Right, yeah. I mean, this is a PhD plus this agenda.
Yeah. But yeah, a lot of things to look more into, I think. A lot of new perspectives that I didn't look at before. Yeah, thank you so much for all the feedback and for all the papers. I will be looking into them, hopefully reading them soon after my exams. Yeah.
Super. Thank you very much for the feedback, Carl. I'll just draw your attention to one question posed by Julie Beaufort in the chat, where she writes a follow-up on Alexander's question. Might the theory of structural dissociation give insight into the modulation of interoception and exteroception? Do you have any comments on that, Carl?
No, you should ask our guest.
Okay.
Sorry?
Super.
You have to answer that one.
I'm not sure I'm fully aware of what the theory of structural dissociation is, but
Yeah, I don't know if Julie, if she could follow up a bit on that question, or whether it might have been answered in some parts of the discussion before. So if Julie, if you're listening, otherwise, I think we will slowly conclude meeting today. And of course, we will once again unmute the mics and give Pranjal a round of applause for her very, very nice presentation. Yes, and as a very last thing, Pranjal, I just want to make sure with you that it's okay that we upload this session to YouTube, and so it will be publicly available.
Yes. Thank you
Super.
so much, everyone, for having me here and letting me present and get the feedback. Thank you so much for sitting through the entire presentation with me as well.
It was
Thank
only
you.
half
Thank
an
you.
hour. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.